At 19, blind since scarlet fever dimmed the world into permanent night when she was 6, Lark Hensley stood in the frozen ditch beyond the Livery Road of Mercy Crossing with no bed to claim, no bread in her pocket, and no hand in all of Wyoming territory reaching back for her. Her Aunt Agatha Voss and cousin Silas had thrown her out before sundown because they had taken her late parents' cabin, their mule, their winter stores, and every decent thing worth keeping, and they said there was no room in a hard town for a sightless girl who could not earn her supper fast enough. What they left her, almost in mockery, was one ugly piece of iron from her father's workbench, a heavy rusted padlock that stained her palms red and seemed better suited to a junk heap than a human life. Men on the boardwalk laughed that she had been paid in scrap. Women listening from behind curtains whispered that grief had turned her foolish for carrying it. Yet deep inside that corroded weight slept a secret old as the town's first hammer blow, a secret that would change not only her own fortune, but the future of every household in Mercy Crossing. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Lark Hensley. If you are watching from a place the world has nearly forgotten, tell us in the comments. Before cold, hunger, and cruelty narrowed her days to the sound of her own careful footsteps, Lark had belonged to a gentler life on the south edge of town where cottonwoods rattled like dry paper in the autumn and the creek spoke differently in every month of the year. Her father, Elias Hensley, was a blacksmith by trade and a patient maker of precise things by temperament, a man known less for the strength of his shoulders than for the exactness of his hands, for the way he could repair a wagon tongue, shoe a skittish mare, straighten a bent hinge, and still pause to sand the rough edge from a child's wooden whistle before sending it home. Her mother, June Hensley, kept books for the Feed Mercantile in winter, tended beans and onions behind the cabin in summer, and possessed that rarer sort of wisdom which lets one speak to sorrow without enlarging it. When fever took Lark's sight, it was June who sat beside her bed at night and named the room back into being, the pine pitch in the chinking, the ticking mantel clock, the wool blanket scratch against her chin, the small draught that entered under the door from the east because the threshold had never sat quite level. "The world is not gone," her mother would whisper. "It has only changed the way it arrives." And because of that, Lark grew up with an attentiveness that other people, too hurried or too certain of their eyes, never learned. She knew her father's mood by the rhythm of his hammer before he ever came through the yard gate. She knew whether rain would fall by the smell that lifted from the sage beyond the fence and by the way the swallows cut lower across the evening. She could tell pennies from nickels by the warm, oily texture of each coin and by the sound they made tapping the table plank. She counted rooms by echoes, doors by hinges, people by the weight of their steps and the shape of the silence they carried around them. In church she knew the widow Mercer had arrived because lavender water always entered 3 breaths before her voice did. At the depot she knew the noon freight from Cheyenne by the cinder smell in its smoke and by the particular tremor it set beneath the platform boards. If sight had once been a window, then touch, hearing, scent, and memory became a whole house built sturdier around her. Elias helped in ways both practical and tender. He notched the handles of jars in the pantry so she would know flour from meal and salt from sugar. He cut tiny filing marks into the stems of garden tools, 1 nick for the hoe, 2 for the rake, 3 for the spade. He taught her to keep one hand trailing fence rails, walls, counters, wagon rims, anything true and fixed, and with the other to test the air ahead like a second set of thoughts. In the forge, where she was forbidden the hottest work, he let her sort nails by head and shank, fit cold washers by size, and recognize good metal from bad by tone. Iron, to him, was a language. Cheap iron gave off a dull, tired complaint when struck. Honest iron answered clean. Listen long enough, he told her, laying her small fingers across a horseshoe still warm from the slack tub, and even stubborn things will tell you what they are meant for. Some of Lark's happiest hours were spent sitting on the worn bench by his work table while he repaired locks, clock latches, buckles, and chains brought in from ranches and freight outfits all over the county. He explained tumblers to her not as mechanisms, but as little arrangements of trust. Every lock, he said, was a promise between what should remain closed and what had at last been rightly opened. He would guide her fingertips over keyways, springs, warding, and shackle collars, letting her feel where cleverness hid itself. Once, when she was about 12, he placed in her hands a strange old padlock heavier than the rest, broad in the body, cold even in July, with a shackle thick as 2 fingers and small irregular ridges near one shoulder. It was deeply rusted, but under the corrosion lived exquisite workmanship. "This one is not for customers," he said quietly. "This one belonged to a man who trusted me when he had nobody else to trust. If ever the day comes when the world turns meaner than it has any right to be, keep hold of this and listen to it carefully." She never forgot the gravity in his voice, though she did not then understand it. He would not say more, and June, hearing the tone of it, asked no questions. Mercy Crossing in those years had the strained prosperity of many frontier towns that had risen too quickly on rumor and ore. There was a stamp mill to the north, 2 boarding houses, a church, a schoolroom, a narrow bank with a false front taller than its honesty, and enough men in good coats speaking of prospects to make a poor man believe the earth itself had promised him a future. Beneath all of it ran older stories, of claims sold cheap and resold dear, of surveys adjusted under lamplight, of water rights argued harder than scripture. Elias was never rich, but he was respected, and June's steadiness made their small home feel larger than many finer ones. Lark learned there that poverty and meanness were not twins. One could live with little and still live nobly. One could also own plenty and starve every room of kindness. When she was 16, winter came hard and early. A drifted road delayed the medicine wagon from Casper by 3 days, and in those 3 days lung fever took June first and Elias after her, as if one grief had reached out and simply pulled the other across. There are households that fall silent when death comes, and there are households that seem, by some cruelty of memory, to keep every ordinary sound alive just long enough to wound you with it. For weeks after the burial, Lark still woke expecting the faint iron rasp of her father's whetstone and the soft thud of her mother's breadboard. Instead there came only stove settling, wind under the eaves, and a stillness so large it seemed to press against her skin. Her nearest relations were her mother's sister Agatha Voss and Agatha's grown son Silas, who had been living meanly on a leased patch west of town and arrived full of sighs, condolences, and sudden practical concern. Agatha spoke in the sugary voice of those who call greed responsibility. Silas moved through rooms as if measuring them for sale. They said a blind girl could not be left alone. They said accounts must be consolidated, debts examined, land protected from speculators, the forge inventory managed by firmer hands. Lark, numb with grief and untrained in suspicion, let them stay a week, then another. By spring they had her mother's blue crockery packed into their own crates, her father's better tools carried off, for safekeeping, and the cabin deed locked away in papers she was not permitted to touch. Agatha wept audibly whenever neighbors visited, speaking of sacrifice and Christian duty. Silas told anyone listening that he would try to make the forge profitable, though Elias had left matters in a confusion. The confusion, as it turned out, was not in Elias's books but in their consciences. At first their cruelty came wrapped in correction. Lark set cups a little off-center, Agatha sighed as if burden itself had developed a body. Lark moved carefully through the pantry, Silas snapped that she took too long. If she mended shirts by feel, they said the stitches were serviceable for the blind, which was another way of saying not good enough for the sighted. Soon correction hardened into insult. They spoke over her as if she were already furniture. They lied about letters read aloud, about money taken in, about what remained of the orchard yield. More than once Lark heard strangers bargaining in the yard over things that had belonged to her parents, and when she asked what had been sold, Agatha answered with sharp innocence that perhaps grief had made the girl imagine voices, yet Lark was not witless, only bereaved. She knew the grain bin was being emptied faster than winter required because she heard extra sacks dragged over the porch. She knew Silas had begun drinking at the Buckhorn because whiskey sourness came home in the weave of his coat and because his boots struck the floor in a boastful swing rather than a tired one. She knew papers were being signed at the table after midnight because ink smelled metallic and alive when newly laid, and because Agatha had taken to hiding the penknife used for trimming quills. There are many ways to rob a blind woman. And one of the commonest is to mistake her patience for ignorance. The padlock remained where Elias had left it for a long while, tucked in the back drawer of the workbench beneath curled shavings and old screws. Lark found it on an afternoon when Silas had gone to town and Agatha was napping in a chair by the stove. Her fingertips, moving through the drawer's neglect, struck its familiar weight, and at once a great hush moved through her, as if her father had set his palm between her shoulders again. The iron was rougher than she remembered, the rust flaked thicker, but the small ridges near the shoulder were still there, deliberate under the corrosion. She slipped it into her apron pocket. Not out of strategy at first, only out of need. In a house being stripped of truth, it felt like one object that had not yet agreed to lie. Silas noticed nothing until midsummer, when the bank agent came and spent an hour with him and Agatha behind the shut door of the front room. That evening their voices took on a sharpened, breathless quality. Agatha accused Lark of ingratitude. Silas complained of dead weight. The next morning, before breakfast, he announced that the cabin and forge had been formally transferred to him in settlement of debts Lark could not hope to understand, and that she would now earn her keep through washing, peeling, and sewing without all that sentimental wandering through father's old junk. Lark stood very still and asked to feel the papers. Silence answered her first, then a cracked laugh from Agatha. "What would you know by touching them?" she said. "You should be thankful we have carried you at all." That was the day Lark ceased mistaking them for cruel kin and understood them as thieves. Still she endured, because endurance was what poor women on the frontier often possessed when power had been apportioned elsewhere. She rose before dawn, split kindling by count and sound, scrubbed shirts against a washboard until her knuckles split, and ate last. In the evening she sat on the back step with the padlock hidden in her shawl and traced it while the night insects throbbed in the weeds. Again and again her thumb found those odd file marks and the deep seam around one side of the body. Once, pressing it close to her ear, she heard a faint interior stir, not a loose rattle, but something tiny answering from within. That sound lodged in her thoughts like a coal that would not die. Autumn brought the final blow. Silas had borrowed against the forge and lost heavily in a mining speculation north of Powder Creek. Men came asking for payment. Agatha, frantic at the thought of losing even what she had stolen, turned all her bitterness on the easiest target. She said Lark drew misfortune. She said blind girls invited pity and pity invited gossip. She said respectable households could not prosper with a useless dependent underfoot. On the first truly bitter evening of November, while the wind dragged dust along the road and the sky smelled of imminent snow, Silas took Lark by the elbow, marched her to the door, thrust her bundleless onto the porch, and said she could keep the old iron trinket she loved so well, since it was the only thing in the place nobody sane would pay a cent for. Agatha added, almost cheerfully, that perhaps she might beg with it as proof of hardship. The door shut. The bolt fell. The cabin that had held her childhood turned itself against her with one square sound. Lark did not beat upon it. Dignity, once taught deeply enough, does not leave a person even when comfort does. She stood listening to the wind in the cottonwoods, to the loose shutter tapping near the roofline, to the muffled clink of dishes within that should have been hers to wash by choice rather than command, and then she turned toward town with the padlock under her coat and the cold ditch receiving her steps like dark water. Mercy Crossing at night was no place for a young woman alone, let alone one without sight, but desperation has always been a rough tutor in movement. Lark measured the road by wagon ruts frozen hard beneath her shoes, by the smell of horse manure thickening near the livery, by the piano from the Buckhorn saloon leaking raggedly through batwing doors. Twice men called out to her and she kept walking. Once a boy, no older than 14 by the crackle in his voice, tried to lead her toward the alley behind the hotel with a false kindness so overperformed that she withdrew her wrist before he touched it. She found shelter that first night behind the warm brick of the Chinese laundry, curled near stacked kindling where soap steam drifted sweet and human through the wall. In the hours before dawn, with her knees against her chest and the padlock between both hands, she began truly to examine the thing not as comfort, but as problem. Rust had a skin all its own, rough and blooming, but beneath it she felt intention. The ridges near the shoulder were not random pitting. They came in sets, one long, one short, two long, a pause, three short. The seam along the side was too even for ordinary casting. Near the keyway, half swallowed by corrosion, sat a spot smoother than the rest, no bigger than a lentil. Lark rubbed it with the edge of her sleeve, warmed the iron with her breath, and pressed her nail into it. Nothing happened. She tilted the lock and listened. There again, that minute interior answer. By morning her fingers were stained orange and tender, but her mind had woken in a way grief had not allowed for months. The next day she went to the only person in town who had ever admired careful work more than profit. His name was Mr. One, proprietor of the laundry and mender of nearly everything too fine or too patient for rougher hands. He had come west laying rail years before and stayed because, as he once told Elias, a place where things were always breaking offered steady employment to a man who knew how to set them right. Lark knew his doorway from the scent of starch and cedar smoke. When she asked if he might spare hot water and a bench, he gave her both without comment. Some kindness enters quietly because it is too dignified to announce itself. Under Mr. Wen's kettle steam, with a rag and a bit of lamp oil, Lark cleaned enough corrosion from the padlock to feel the pattern better. Mr. Wen did not pry into her eviction until she asked whether he would describe the object aloud while she traced it. His voice moved slowly, respecting her attention. The body, he said, was iron but inlaid at the seam with a narrower line of brass almost hidden by rust. The top shoulder bore tiny file marks arranged in groups. One side carried a maker's stamp nearly erased, not a company mark, but initials interlocked, E and V, beneath a small star. At that, Lark felt the blood stir in her. Elias Hensley had not made the lock. Someone else had placed it in his care demeure. One, after a thoughtful silence, said there had once been an Elias Vale in Mercy Crossing, years before Lark was old enough to remember. Not her father, but a mining surveyor, part owner of the first stamp works, a man rumored to have vanished after a dispute over claims and payroll. Some said he had fled with gold. Others said partners had cheated him and the town repeated the lie because lies are often easier to house than shame. Lark asked what the star beneath the initials might mean. Mr. Wen said only that old craftsmen sometimes marked private commissions with symbols understood by few. She pressed the smooth spot again, this time while turning the shackle not outward, but slightly inward toward the body the way her father had once shown her on a trickhasp used by stage companies. Something shifted. A catch, tiny but undeniable, released under her thumb with a sigh so faint she felt it before she heard it. The side seam lifted a hair's breadth. Mr. Wen drew in breath. Together, with the point of a fine needle, they coaxed open a concealed plate no wider than a finger. From the hollow inside the padlock came a slender coil wrapped in oilcloth and a second object thin as a matchstick, likely brass. Lark's hands trembled, though not from fear alone. The oilcloth held a strip of tightly rolled parchment protected all those years from damp. The brass sliver had been filed along one edge into a peculiar tooth pattern. Mr. Wen unrolled the parchment and described what he saw, a map, but not of open country. It seemed to show tunnels or passageways beneath a square block of buildings, marked by measurements, arrows, and one circle inked heavier than the rest. Along the bottom ran written lines in a cramped hand. Lark closed her eyes, as blind people often do when concentrating though darkness does not change, and listened as he read. The writing spoke of the Mercy Consolidated Workings, of an emergency reserve, of wages held back not to cheat laborers but to buy out predatory claims once certain deeds matured. It mentioned shares set aside in trust for public well water, school expansion, winter relief, and widows of the mine collapse of '81. It named those assets collectively, almost grandly, as the Golden Mercy Estate. Then, in a final note, Elias Vale wrote that if he were silenced before the transfer could be made lawful, the lock and map must reach the Hensley Forge, where honest hands will keep them until an honest opening. At the very end were 6 words that struck Lark like a bell: trust the one who reads by touch. June Hensley had taught Lark raised script by sewing knots into cloth and embossing letters on card. Elias had marked tools for her fingers. Somewhere in the life of that vanished surveyor, a man had believed enough in the integrity of Lark's parents to plan for a reader he would never meet. And now, cast out with nothing, she held in her palm the first true inheritance left her. The circle on the map corresponded, Mr. Wynne guessed, to the old assay office lot behind the abandoned North Stamp Mill, a place shuttered since before the panic years, its cellar entrance is said to have collapsed. The brass sliver, when fitted into the padlock's keyway, did not open it but changed the feel of the wards inside. Not a key, Mr. Wynne murmured, more like a guide. Lark remembered her father saying every lock was a promise. This one, it seemed, had promised not merely treasure but testimony. News travels through small towns the way smoke finds rafters, and before the second day was out, someone had seen Lark at the laundry, someone else had noticed the old assay lot mentioned, and a different someone carried word to Silas that the blind girl he had thrown away was asking after buried workings and old owners. Greed, when it hears even the rumor of value, wakes faster than mercy. Silas came to the laundry near dusk with Agatha behind him, breathless and syrup-voiced again, calling Lark dear child, dear family, dear mistaken girl. Lark knew from the scrape of his heel that he was angry enough to strike if unobserved, and from the careful sweetness in Agatha's tone that witnesses stood near. She said they had worried all night. She said home was home. She said any old lock found in the forge naturally belonged to the household now, and all discussions of property should be left to proper authorities. For the first time since her parents' deaths, Lark answered without softness. She said the forge had been her father's before Silas ever crossed its threshold. She said a thief's hands did not improve a claim by touching it. Then she rose from the bench, tucked the padlock into her coat, and walked straight past them, guided by the laundry's steam on one side and the open evening air on the other. Behind her she heard Silas swear under his breath and Mr. Wynne set down something heavy enough to suggest, politely and unmistakably, that the next unwise motion would be witnessed. The proper authorities proved little better. Mayor Durham Pike, who was no kin to Silas but shared both his surname and his appetite, called Lark to the bank office 2 mornings later under pretense of civic concern. There she found not only the mayor but also the bank agent, a deputy clerk, and Reverend Stills, summoned perhaps to lend the room a scent of righteousness. They spoke at her in the rounded phrases of men arranging a theft to resemble prudence. Old mining matters were complicated. Unverified documents could cause unrest. Any moneys or claims discovered must naturally be handled by the town's established leadership. For her own protection, they suggested, Lark should surrender the lock, the map, and any associated notes, after which they would see that she received a modest stipend and perhaps placement in a charitable home farther east where, her limitations, would be better accommodated. People often think insult is loud. Some of its worst forms are perfectly mannered. Lark sat very still, feeling the grain of the chair under her fingertips, smelling the bank's waxed floor and stale ledgers, hearing the mayor's watch chain lightly click his vest button when he shifted. Each detail steadied her. She asked whether the trust writings named in old records had ever been filed. A pause. She asked whether the widow's reserve after the collapse of 81 had ever been distributed. Another pause, longer. She asked whether the school fund promised when the North Mill expanded had built even one additional room. The silence thickened until Reverend Stills cleared his throat. Men who speak for order dislike being questioned by those they have already placed beneath notice. So the battle lines formed, not with gunfire or grand declarations, but with paper, rumor, and control over doors. Agatha told town women Lark had gone strange with loss and imagined fortunes in scrap iron. Silas prowled the north lots at night. The mayor arranged for the assay site to be declared unsafe and posted a notice forbidding entry. A deputy shadowed Lark whenever she neared Main Street. Yet Mercy Crossing was not made only of cowards. The widow Mercer offered Lark a narrow bed in her back room above the milliner's shop. Mr. Wynne copied the map by hand in case the first should be stolen. Old Tom Bell, who had lost 2 brothers in the 81 collapse and never believed the company's books, swore aloud at the feed store that if any reserve had truly existed, the town had a right to hear of it in daylight. The schoolteacher, Miss Arlen, spent an evening reading county archives to Lark and found references to a deferred land trust attached to the dissolved Mercy Consolidated Partnership. Nothing conclusive, but enough to prove the past had not been as cleanly buried as the powerful preferred. what Lark possessed above all was not force, but a manner of attention no one around her had learned to defend against. The map, once described repeatedly, became almost physical in her mind. She memorized every turn and spacing through numbers and rhythm. The old assay office lot had once stood beside a retaining wall of dressed stone. A tunnel ran beneath it toward the dry wash. The heavy circle lay not in the office itself, but under what had been the orway room, offset by 11 paces from the east footing. One night, after listening from the alley until she was certain Silas's boots had gone toward the saloon and the deputy's cough had faded south, she asked Mr. One and old Tom to accompany her to the north lot. Not to dig wildly, but to listen, rue and speak, if touched with respect. Wind moves differently over boarded ground than over hollow space. Stone keeps cold differently than packed earth. Lark knelt in the weeds with both gloved palms flat, then tapped with a hammer handle along the line where the map suggested the footing ran. Solid answers came first, dense and short. Then, 3 feet farther in, a lower note, carrying a breath beneath it. Hollow. Old Tom sucked air through his teeth. Together they cleared drifted soil and broken plank. Until a buried trap of timber and iron took shape under their hands. On its edge sat a rusted hasp, wider than common, fitted to receive not a key alone but a particular lock body. The padlock belonged there. Even then, they did not wrench it open. They covered the place again and returned before dawn, because Lark knew enough now to understand that discovery without witnesses would only feed theft. She went the next morning not to the mayor, but to Judge Harlan Reeve, retired, half-deaf, and stubborn enough to be honest simply because he no longer cared whom it offended. He had once ridden circuit when Mercy Crossing was a cluster of tents. He remembered Elias Vale. He remembered, too, talk of community shares meant to civilize the boom before greed ate it bare. When Mr. Wen read him the copied note and Miss Arlen confirmed the archive references, the old judge rapped his cane and said the opening would be done publicly, on town ground, with witnesses from every interested household. If Mayor Pike objected, he could do so where all could hear, and object he did. So did Silas. So did Agatha, who arrived at the site wrapped in indignation as if it were a shawl. But by then half the town had gathered in the wind, widows in dark gloves, laborers smelling of hay and coal dust, children shushed into stillness, men from the livery and the store and the church, each sensing that something older than one girl's hardship was about to answer for itself. Lark stood at the center with the padlock in her hands and the brass guide tucked inside her sleeve. Someone murmured that it was madness to let a blind girl lead. Judge Reeve said dryly that sight had not notably improved the judgment of those who had opposed her. The buried hasp was cleaned. The iron mouth received the padlock as if meeting its own name after a long separation. Lark felt the shape settle, then inserted the brass guide into the keyway and turned the body not left, as Mr. Wen had first expected, but right and inward, following the pressure memory whispered through her hands. Inside the mechanism, tumblers rose in a sequence she could feel more than hear, 1, then 2 together, then a delayed third as delicate as a bead dropping into place. For a suspended second the whole crowd seemed to stop breathing. Then the shackle sprang loose with a crack like frost splitting on a trough. Beneath the trap lay steps breathing up air untouched by sun for years, cool and mineral and still carrying, astonishingly, the faint dry sweetness of stored wood. Lanterns were lit. Judge Reeve, Old Tom, Mr. One, Miss Arlen, Reverend Stills, and Lark descended together. She walked with one hand on the wall, counting stone joints, the other on the rail. The chamber below was not grand in size, but grandeur is often a matter of concentration. Shelves lined the room. Boxes sat banded in metal. Sealed tins, rolled surveys, ledgers wrapped in oilcloth, deed folios, and at the back, according to the voices lifting around her, 6 compact chests stamped with the star and initials of Elias Vale. When old Tom pried one open under the judge's instruction, the chamber answered with the unmistakable intimate sound of heavy coins shifting against one another. Gold, yes. But more than gold, ledgers read aloud there in the cellar made the town's history reform around them like iron reheated. Elias Vale and two early partners had intended the Golden Mercy estate not as a private hoard but as a reserve to buy back water access, protect workers' wages during the railroad slump, fund a second schoolroom, maintain a winter coal allotment, and keep the town from being swallowed by the bank and outside claim speculators when the first veins thinned. One partner had died. Another had sold his influence to men who later became the fathers of Mercy Crossing's present leadership. Vale, fearing seizure, had hidden the reserve and its proofs, entrusting the lock to Elias Hensley until lawful conditions could be restored. Then he himself had vanished after an accident. Nobody in that chamber any longer believed accidental, quiet justice has a sound unlike triumph. It is less a shout than a long inhalation from those who finally hear truth stated in full, above ground. When the boxes and papers began to emerge, the crowd changed. Murmurs became names, dates, remembered promises, buried grievances suddenly anchored. Widow Bell recognized her husband's signature among wage records. Miss Arlen found the school allotment entry. Reverend Stills, to his credit, read aloud the widow relief provisions in a voice that shook. Mayor Pike attempted to claim municipal oversight, but Judge Reeve, cane-planted like law itself, ordered the documents carried directly to the courthouse for filing and the chests sealed under public watch. Silas shoved forward once, saying the lock had come from his forge and therefore all attached discoveries were his. Half a dozen townsmen laughed without kindness. Agatha tried tears. Nobody was moved by them now. When a lie loses the shelter of uncertainty, it stands naked and usually smaller than expected. The weeks that followed did not turn Mercy Crossing into paradise, because no town made of flawed people becomes heaven simply because a cellar opens. But the reserve was real, the claims legal, and the proof undeniable enough that even distant county officials, once notified, could not easily bury it again. An audit exposed falsified transfers tied to the bank. Mayor Pike resigned before formal charges spread farther. Silas lost the cabin and forge when the deed review showed fraud in the debt settlement. Agatha found that those who had enjoyed her gossip were not eager to house her when her usefulness ended. No mob formed. No rope swung. The punishment fitted the age and the story better than spectacle would have. Reputations collapsed, ill-gotten property returned, and doors that had opened for the greedy quietly closed. As for Lark, the town offered her what it had once withheld, standing, choice, and the dignity of being consulted rather than managed. Judge Reeve asked whether she wished to claim the estate personally, since the lock had come through her father's keeping and she had solved what no one else could open. She answered in the manner her parents had raised in her. She would accept enough for a secure life, the restored Hensley home, and the forge that had been her father's. The rest, because it had always been meant for Mercy Crossing, should go where the ledgers intended. Wells were repaired. A proper winter fund was established for widows and laborers injured in the mines. The school gained its second room at last, with raised letter books ordered from back east after Miss Arlen wrote 3 determined letters and refused to accept the first no. The north lot was cleared and a public warehouse built over the old vault, honest in purpose this time. Mr. Wen received the contract for its household linens and mending. Old Tom was hired to oversee stores, because memory, once vindicated, becomes a kind of expertise, and Lark, blind still and no less herself for having become the most talked-of name in 3 counties, took over the forge not by swinging the largest hammer, but by ordering it according to the intelligence she had always carried. She employed 2 apprentices and taught them that tools returned to their pegs mattered as much as strength. She learned inventory by touch, accounts by raised notation, customers by voice. Children came to watch her test chain links for flaws by ringing them lightly against the bench. Ranchers who had once pitted her now trusted her measures because she missed less than sighted men in a hurry. Over the door she hung the old padlock, cleaned but not polished, its rust scars left visible as witness. Beneath it Mr. Wen painted a small gold star on black wood. When winter returned, colder even than the one that had cast her out, no girl slept behind the laundry wall in Mercy Crossing for lack of a bed. Coal went where the reserve book said it should. Bread found the narrow tables first. The town had not been saved by gold alone, but by the truth attached to it and by the one person nearly everyone had considered least likely to bear it safely. That, perhaps, is how restorations most often begin. Not with the loud arrival of power, but with the refusal of one disregarded soul to surrender what she knows in her bones, and so, when we remember the first lines of her hardship, we do not remember them only for the cold ditch, the shut door, or the laughter that followed a blind orphan carrying a rusted padlock as though scrap iron could shelter a life. We remember them because they reveal how poor the judgment of the comfortable can be, how quickly a town may learn to measure human worth by the wrong instrument, and how completely that measure can fail. Lark Hensley never recovered her sight. The world did not reverse its wound for the sake of a neat ending. Instead, something better and truer happened. She proved that vision is not the same as eyesight, that a person may walk in darkness and still perceive structure, motive, danger, and grace more clearly than those staring at noon with greedy eyes wide open. The lock answered her because her father had taught her to listen, her mother had taught her to trust the arriving world in all its other forms, and suffering, though it had narrowed her comforts, had not narrowed her spirit. The town she restored was not merely richer after the vault was opened, it was chastened, made more honest by the fact that justice had entered through the hands it had once tried to dismiss. If her name carries through Mercy Crossing even now, it is not because she became a legend of gold, but because she remained Lark, steady-palmed, clear-hearted, unwilling to harden into bitterness, and brave enough to believe that even an object everyone else had written off might still be keeping faith with the future. That was the true sightless journey of Lark Hensley, and that was her worth. Thank you for staying with us through the long dark and the warm return of this story. If Lark's journey moved you, share it with someone who may need reminding that what looks broken, burdensome, or forgotten is not always empty of promise. And before you go, tell us this: what is a time in your own life when you found real value in something other people had already written off? We always love hearing where these stories meet your own. Until next time, stay close.